How's it going, guys? You're watching Dirt Bike Channel. I'm your host, Kyle Brotherson, and today we're going to review the Yamaha YZ250FX. I never would have guessed it. This truly is an off-road racing bike. This isn't a WR250. This isn't a Honda CRFX 250. This is a racing bike. That is an off-road racing bike. 4-stroke, 250, ball of fun. You know, if you've paid attention to the channel, if you've seen any of the videos that I did when I started riding this thing did not disappoint. Right off the bat, I could tell that this wasn't just a trail riding WR. I know there's a bunch of guys out there that are WR lovers and they're great bikes, but this is not a WR. This is a closed course race bike. This thing doesn't have the internal baffle, you know, the intake baffles that the WR has. It doesn't have the throttle stops. It doesn't have a restrictive muffler. It doesn't have an unprogrammable black box, you know, ignition box. It's lighter than the WRs. It is louder than the WRs. The WRs, in short, the WRs are slower, softer, and quieter than this YZ250FX. And it filled a void in Yamaha's lineup, and they knew it. They knew that KTM was cleaning house in the off-road racing segment for the GNCC style and hare scramble style racer, and they wanted to produce a bike like this, and also the 450FX that could compete with some of these Austrian-made bikes that were just heads and tails better, faster, you know, than what Yamaha had to offer. And this thing, right off the bat, did not disappoint. I knew it was a fast bike straight off the gate as soon as I had ridden it for 2 minutes. So let's start off with some things that I like about the bike. Right off the bat, I like the fact that it's fast. It not only feels fast, but this bike is fast. Even though it's just a 250, this thing will go just as fast as anybody needs to go. And it's also playful. I just got off a 450 before I'd purchased this bike. And when you compare this thing to the 450, this just felt so much more playful than that 450. So that was a big thumbs up for me. You know, one of the things I like about these 250s is when you come out of a corner and you mash on it, you don't just like fly up into a wheelie or get so much wheel spin as you would with the 450. When you're riding these 250s, they don't actually just tear your arms off like the 450s want to do. So if you're used to, you can come out of a corner on this bike and you can just give a fistful of throttle and it won't buck you off the back. So I really like that. Something else that I like is that they've got the pipe out of the way. One of the benefits of the way that Yamaha has designed their cylinder here and the head with it tilting backwards, which I'll get into some disadvantages of that in a little bit, but we're starting with the positives here. What that does is because the exhaust comes out the rear, they wrap the exhaust around the rear of the head and then it comes around the front. Now, it's all completely contained behind the frame right here. So you're never going to bash that on any rock, anything. You shouldn't ever be able to hit that. They've got the mounting brackets down here to put on the skid plate. I wish that the 250s would come with a skid plate. This is a 2015 model, and in that year, only the 450s came with a skid plate. You had to buy this separately if you had the 250. So I like how the pipe is out of the way. I also like how they've given you a good kickstand here. And this kickstand, I've never had any problem with it coming down when I'm out on the trail or doing jumps or anything like that. I know that you can't use the kickstand on like a motocross track, but when you're out there doing off-road riding, it's super awesome to have a kickstand. Another thing that they got right, that Yamaha got right, is this bike actually starts really well. With the electric start, I never had any problems with it. The battery is still kind of one of the old lead acid kind of battery, so it's not super light, but it did start really well. And Yamaha also didn't take the Kickstarter off the bike, so you have an auxiliary way to start it. That is a major, major plus there. I'm so glad that Yamaha did that, and I wish that KTM would actually put their dang Kickstarters on back on their 4-stroke bikes, these off-road bikes. Another thing that I liked the suspension on it. I didn't love the suspension, but I did like it. It's the KYB SSS, you know, the speed sensitive suspension on the front, the forks, which the magazines seem to love out on the motocross tracks. And while it's good for off-road, I wouldn't say that it's great. I think it would need to be revalved for somebody like me, but suspension is something that's different for everyone. Overall though, the bike felt really planted and really stable in most of the conditions that I rode in, and that was even running like 15 pounds of pressure in the tires, because a lot of the places that I rode was so rocky that you have to combat pinch flats, and so I have to run really, really hard pressure, like 15 pounds of pressure. And even with that amount of pressure, this bike felt pretty planted in most of the places that I took it. The brakes are actually not that bad. You've got hydraulic front and hydraulic rear brakes, and although they're not quite as good as some of the Austrian bikes that I've been riding, they're serviceable, and there's not a ton of drop off there. The clutch on this bike is a steel braided clutch, wire. So it's not a hydraulic clutch, but it works. This bike is new, and so it's fairly easy to pull, and it's not a huge drop off there. I'd prefer it to be hydraulic. Some of you guys might not. You might want to have, the clutch cable, the steel braided cable, a manual style clutch like that. But one thing that I don't really dig the air box. I pulled this thing off a couple of times off camera, and I kind of took out some of the keepers. The way that this thing works is it comes right up here on the bike, and it's up here in front of the fuel tank. It's up here on the shrouds, and you've got three little bolts that they put in 2015. They made them. See how it's just kind of weird to get this thing together. Some of the time I can do this right off the bat, and other times, okay, there it is. Other times I struggle with it. So now I've got that on there. I got 1, 2, and 3 of the things in, and then I'll put the fender shrouds on. And sometimes I can get this right off the bat, and other times it just kind of fights me a little bit. You also, for those of you that don't know, you've got your fuel cap here under the seat. So there's this seat extension, and if you want to do a refuel, what you have to do is pop the front of the seat off and then get down to your cap. And sometimes it's really hard to get your hand down in here, get your fingers down here and turn this. Sometimes I have a hard time with that sometimes. Not only that, but this is a very small fuel tank. For an off-road bike, I'll have to look up the exact specs, but there's not a lot of fuel that you can put in this bike, so you better hope it gets really good mileage. And speaking of mileage, I don't think these bikes get really, really great mileage. They're so fun to ride, and you end up just kind of dumping it and giving a fistful of throttle out of corners, that I don't think that you're gonna get a ton of range on these things. I mean, I guess if you ride it a little bit more like a grandpa than like a kid with his hair on fire, you're gonna get a little bit better mileage. But it's so fun to ride, and with that small fuel tank, I haven't been able to test exactly like how many miles I can go, and it depends, because I change throttle positions all the time and different riding conditions and stuff, but I don't think there's a ton of range because of that little fuel tank. The EFI on this bike works really, really well. The only problem with the EFI is that right off idle, this bike tends to be quite lurchy. And I notice it here in my grass. When I take it out of the shop and I go into the grass, and the bike is, you're just in first gear, it's hard as I leave the yard to actually keep the bike from tearing my grass out, because it will, if you just like nudge the throttle a millimeter, it just like the bike goes and it just wants to lurch, and it'll want to spin that rear wheel, especially because the first gear is really, really low on this bike. And it's something, I put my dad on it. My dad's a 62, and he thought that it was really, really too responsive and too lurchy right off idle in that first gear, because the first gear is really low. They've geared this bike down to what like a KTM XCW would be. And so first and second gear on this, it's got that wide ratio transmission, and first and second gear are really, really low, and the sucker is just it runs so clean right off idle that it's kind of lurchy. And some of the time when I'm in loose stuff and rocky stuff, that's been a problem, and it's caused me to kind of lose a little bit of traction on the rear. So I wish it ran a little bit softer. I mean, it's not like it's got too much power, it just is so responsive and so lurchy right off idle in those low RPMs that it can be a little bit of a handful in certain situations. Yamaha did not include handguards with this bike, so it's kind of like their motocross bikes. And although handguards are not super expensive, I do think that if you're paying this much for a dirt bike, they should come with at least some style, you know, flag style handguard for us off-road riders, because you're gonna need something out there. Something that I noticed right off the bat when I was moving the bike around on and off stands is it felt heavy, and there was no good place to grab on this. Like you come down here and you kind of pinch in your hands, and you come over here, and when you try to lift the bike around on and off the stand, right here on the frame, this is a good place to grab, but you're lifting the entire weight of the bike and it just feels like it's a sack of lead. So I wish that they would have put some sort of a grab point back here on the bike so you can get some leverage as you're moving it around. And I ended up having to put one of these straps on here because I got into situations out on the trail where I just didn't have anything to grab, and I needed to drag the back end around for something. And then this also helps me to get it on and off, you know, on and off bike stands. And so I wish that they would have put a handle back there so that you can get some leverage on this thing, because it does feel heavy when you're moving it. It doesn't feel super heavy when you're riding it, unless of course you ride it back to back with like a KTM 250FX CF, and then this does feel heavy. But when you're just moving it around, it can feel heavy. Speaking of heavy, just to kind of keep going on that topic, this bike feels a lot lighter than a Yamaha 450 or any of the other 450s that I've been riding. But it feels heavy. The front end of this bike feels heavy compared to the KTMs. I know the bike is a little bit heavier, and it definitely feels heavier when you ride them back to back. What was your experience?
Yeah, when I rode the KTM for the first time, I only killed it once, and I felt really comfortable. I felt like it was light and nimble, that I had good speed. I could stand up longer on this bike and dart into corners a little bit better and kind of bounce off and wheelie off stuff a lot better. And then I switched to the Yamaha and immediately felt the weight. I felt like basically when I'd go into a hairy situation, the bike wouldn't respond how I wanted it to. And I felt the weight. And whereas the front forks were good, and I felt like it wasn't as choppy and it wasn't as bouncy as the front forks on that, I just didn't like it. I just had a hard time, and we both spent a lot of time on both bikes, so it's not that I'm not comfortable and know what this bike does. And in the hard stuff, I really struggled with it.
Here's a place where Yamaha could have done a lot better. This whole fuse block is exposed. This is just here's the back of the frame, and then this is the subframe. And right in here, it's kind of just above the fender. This is where all your fuses are, and you've got wires and fuses and everything. And this is all completely exposed, guys. It wouldn't have been that hard to put this under a cover, and I hope that Yamaha does that in the future, because this just kind of looks chintzy and cheap, and it's so easy for dirt to get in here and to get onto this, you know, this fuse block and in this electrical area. I know I called out a lot of things that I think could have been improved, or things that kind of bugged me, but if I'm dead honest, overall, this is a pretty sweet bike. And I think Yamaha, for just coming into the market, because this is the 2015 model, for bringing this in, I think they got a lot of things right. And I think it's a really phenomenal bike. And there's a lot of good stuff to build on here for the future. And I think Yamaha is going to do that. And they're just going to continue to make this bike better. And it's already good. I think a ton of you guys out there have these bikes and you love them. And there's no reason not to love it, because there's so much to love. I'm super excited to be able to maybe get my hands on the 2-stroke version of this, because I think it could actually be really phenomenal. This bike feels fast, it feels fun, it's fun to just play around on, it's fun to go pounding through the whoops, and it can do the technical stuff too. I mean, I took this thing up the Razorback Trail and it did just as well as any of the other 4-strokes that I've ever taken up the thing. I mean, it didn't beat my 2-stroke times, but I actually was able to make it up clean on this bike, and I couldn't make it up clean on the KTM 4-stroke. So hats off to Yamaha for making the bike that we want. We want more choices in the market, and this YZ250FX is a really sweet package. and I think a ton of guys would be very, very happy with it. If you can live with some of the little things that I kind of nitpicked on, which a lot of it was nitpicking, then you're gonna have a phenomenal bike for a lot of years to come. Yamaha makes a bulletproof bike. The suspension is proven, the motor is proven, everything on this thing is really nice, and I think that you guys would really like a Yamaha YZ250FX. Thanks for tuning in, guys.